Hey, this is going to be the last part of the rhythm strafing series. I had a lot of ideas for trick stabbing that I've thought about over the years. This will be the video to compile the last of my ideas on trick stabbing and some tips for general spy gameplay. Enjoy. Anchor points. An anchor point is a point in space that the enemy keeps their crosshair on. When the enemy is moving, they hold their movement keys while tracking that anchor point. The anchor point can also move. This anchor point can be manipulated by your movement and by where you're looking, like with a head fake, reverse head fake, or backpedal. The enemy will always try to have you and their anchor point within their FOV if they're aware of you. The enemy will also place their anchor points in a position near you. The enemy can also have anchor points even if they're not aware of you, which you can use to predict how they will turn when trying to backstab them. The enemy can also have an anchor point near a corner when they're not aware of you, or aware of you but don't see you. Take advantage of this. Dead zones. A dead zone is an area between yourself and the enemy's anchor point where you will always have line of sight to the enemy's back. This dead zone is a perfect circle where you and their anchor point are on the opposite ends of the circle's circumference. In this dead zone, it literally doesn't matter where the enemy moves in this circle, you will always see their back. This is why you can sometimes head fake an opponent and you can still stab them no matter what movement keys they are holding. When you head fake, you're essentially trying to cast a net and trap the enemy in it. You throw away the enemy's anchor point as far away as you possibly can from yourself, while you try to close distance to where the enemy will be to cast a large net around the enemy, which is the dead zone. Anchor points and tracking patterns. When it comes to active and passive tracking, they tell you how to keep as much distance as you possibly can from the enemy's anchor point. The enemy likes to keep you on their screen in many ways, like moving their mouse trying to predict you, looking in your general direction, aiming ahead of you to aim at you while accounting for their reaction time, and so on. When the enemy is or is not moving their mouse and how they do it, there is always an anchor point, and your goal is to get as far away from the anchor point as possible, which active and passive tell you how to do. I'll be expanding on active and passive tracking later in the video. Anchor points and movement patterns. The movement patterns I've talked about in the previous parts all had anchor points. I categorize these patterns into passive and active patterns because they usually place their anchor points in ways that can either be countered with an active or passive counter. If you want a general formula for trying to counter someone's movement, you basically create as much distance between yourself and their anchor point, while you close as much distance between yourself and where the enemy will be and trap the enemy in your dead zone. If the enemy never chases you and keep backing away from you, then you can just go for someone else for a stab since they're not worth your time trying to stab them. One thing to note about long and async is that it's possible to keep them on those movement patterns longer if you look at their anchor points while countering them. Grids. In TF2, the layout of any given area is in a grid. The props, entrances, walls, corners and whatever else are laid out in a grid. The direction the enemy looks at by default is to the grid in some way. People like to look in a way where they can see the layout of an area, see what's around them, and not bump into anything unintentionally. If an area is really open, then the enemy isn't going to be snapped onto the grid as much compared to a tight area. The enemy is most comfortable when the direction they're looking at is snapped onto the grid. This is why if the enemy isn't moving their mouse, they're snapped onto the grid. If the enemy does wide and fast turns, they're snapping to the grid as well, even if they turn back afterwards, which will always be snapped to the grid. In these scenarios, the enemy is aligning himself and his anchor point with the grid. If the enemy is keeping their mouse still while not being snapped onto the grid, you can snap them to the grid easily if you reposition their anchor point just a little bit. The enemy is not a robot though, so they will always slightly deviate from the grid of an area even if they're snapped onto it. Collision and grids. I recommend you watch the Spy 101 tutorial on collision, phase stabs and backpedals before watching this section or any section related to it. Any given area's grid can either be aligned or rotated depending on how the collision hull is aligned, and we check whether an area is aligned with the collision hull or not by walking into corners and strafing along the grid while colliding with a player. If you hold W at a corner of an area and you go through it, the area is aligned. If you do not go through it, the area is rotated. If you strafe along the grid while colliding with a player and you do not get pushed backwards or forwards in some way, maybe your movement gets stopped completely, the area is aligned. If you get pushed backwards or forwards while strafing along the grid while colliding with a player, the area is rotated. If you're in an aligned area, you want to collide with the enemy going diagonally across the grid more or less. If you're in a rotated area, you want to collide with the enemy going across the grid more or less. This way, you'll ensure that you always hit the enemy's collision hole at an angle. You want to do this so your movement never gets blocked by the enemy unintentionally. This way, you will always be closing distance with the enemy. If you collide with the enemy, you slide off of them. If they back away, you still close distance with them. Paths. When the enemy is moving, they're usually moving from point A to point B when you're not around. They might be going to an entrance, health pack, cover, etc. The enemy might prioritize sticking to walls and corners in your presence and take their path to a certain destination while sticking to them. The enemy always has an anchor point when they have a set path they're going to as well. Knowing their path, you can move to where they're going to be while also trying to manipulate their anchor point to be away from you, trying to trap them in the dead zone. If you trap the enemy with your collision hull and they have an escape route, then you know what path you're going to take and take advantage of it. Movement. With trick stabbing, you'll have to think like a speedrunner, trying to get a trick stab on someone as fast as humanly possible. This is why I made this theory and why I sometimes dwell on seemingly small things in these tutorials. The more variables you can account for and manipulate with your movement, the faster and more reliable your trick stabs will be. The faster you can stab somebody, the better. If you need more bait to trick stab someone faster, then bait them more. If brute forcing a stab lets you trick stab someone faster, then you should brute force a stab more. Usually it's an element of bait and brute force that makes your trick stabs as optimal and as fast as possible. Keeping your momentum at all times lets you use your momentum to bait, juke and stab the enemy even better. If you haven't already, you should have the null movement script because it lets you switch strafes faster than you normally could. Instead of thinking about trick stabbing in terms of techniques, you should be thinking about it in terms of how you use your momentum as efficiently as humanly possible. Only stopping when you think you'll be able to get a faster stab that way, like let's say glue, deadlock or a ghost stab. I'll be explaining these stabs later in the video. You can blur the difference between a backpedal and a head fake. You can even blur the difference between a surf stab and a backpedal. It's the concepts behind your movement that matter, like rhythm and their tracking patterns. The line between all trick stabbing techniques can be blurred. When you're in the air compared to the ground, essentially you need to have different inputs than when you're on the ground, and you cannot change directions as fast when you're in the air compared to being on the ground. That's it. There's also taking into account a lot of variables by using your movement that accounts for a lot of those variables already, like head faking. Head faking displaces the enemy's anchor point and makes it so people holding different movement keys get countered in a similar way, because they're in your dead zone. There's also going at the enemy diagonally along the grid of an area if it's aligned, or going along the grid if the area is rotated, so you always close distance with the enemy no matter if you collide with them or not. There's also a lot more movement things that work like this that I've covered in these videos, but these are two examples of this. The movement channel.
Movement is a channel, the main channel, in which players use to communicate with each other, that's completely open to being manipulated.
This quote is still applicable today, but there is more nuance to this quote than people might think, especially if you want to understand how my theory fits with it. The enemy has their own channel that you need to be at a certain frequency to access with your movement. Rhythm is the frequency you need to be at to access that channel. You will also have to have an offset as well. Basically, whenever you change strafes, the enemy should be starting to look in the other direction every time. If you are not tapped into that channel with rhythm, then all that you will hear from the enemy is noise. Once you've accessed that channel and you start communicating with the enemy, you have to figure out how much the enemy is listening to your movement. You can read the enemy's player model for this and use psychology. If the enemy is listening to you to the point you can create an opening for drone tracking, they're actively listening to your movement. If the enemy is not listening to you enough to where you push an existing opening from their lack of tracking, they're listening to your movement passively. How much the enemy is listening to you can sometimes change the rhythm. One beat of the rhythm they can be active, the other beat passive, and vice versa, depending on the situation. You can even bait the enemy into not listening to your movement by giving them noisy movement like with spinning, shuffling, and so on. If the enemy attempts to track you while you're spinning or shuffling, they will essentially confuse themselves reading noisy movement. So they will turn passive by moving their mouse randomly or not moving their mouse at all. In the end, the best way to learn active and passive tracking is through experience after you've gotten the hang of rhythm. Nuance of twitching. In part 2, I said that twitches are a passive counter as a generalization, but it's better to think of it as trying to bait the enemy into passively tracking you, or you trying to make the enemy go active and stabbing them earlier than usual. If the enemy passively tracks your twitch, then goes active afterwards, it's possible that she can be countered if they react to you fast enough. If the enemy goes active to your twitch, you can basically counter them then and there if you twitched once. If you spammed twitches while going around the enemy would be forced to passively track you. If you twitch, then your movement after the twitch will have to at least give one beat of the enemy's rhythm to remain readable. If there are two counters in any given situation, it's usually a choice between active and passive. There are situations where the enemy goes along you or any combination of it, and you have the choice between twitching to make them go active or intercept them if they won't fall for a twitch. Chain order. When you see a group of players or are about to chain, you should have a plan on how to chain them. You should know the order at which you trick stab your enemies. Before you trick stab the player you're facing, you should then be focusing on the next player in the chain order so you can read him. You should be able to read the player you're facing. Once you read him, you should be countering him while focusing on someone else. It's also ideal if you try to bait the enemy as much as you possibly can when chaining. When you're dealing with one player, you should be able to use that player as bait. You can also use your movement that killed your previous enemy as bait for the next, being adaptable. That's why I talked about switching two opponents behind you in the previous part, because you're maximizing your bait that way from player to player. You should try to take advantage of jump stabs, understabs, and corner stabs as much as you possibly can to take a little less damage. Jump stabs are one of the best trick stabbing techniques because once you're over the enemy, it's hard for the enemy to not get stabbed. So, you should take advantage of that fact. Similar things happen with the understab. The corner stabs don't have to be the standard corner stab technique either. You can pop out of the corner and do a normal trick stab technique off of it. The corner essentially acts as a bait. If you cannot trick stab someone in the chain order, you move up the list and go for a person that's a little bit higher up the list instead, and skip over the person that you missed in the order. Chaining isn't really about crowd control most of the time, it's about order. Backstabs are instant kills, so you have to order your enemies for a chain instead of crowd controlling them most of the time, unless they're bunched up. Lurching. Lurching is basically where you use your keys alone for air strafing. I stole this name from Apex Legends for a similar technique. If you want to air strafe to the right, you hold the key in the direction you're going, and then go clockwise for your movement keys. If you want to air strafe to the left, then you hold the key in the direction you're going, then go anti-clockwise for your movement. You can change the keys faster if you have less momentum, slower if you have more momentum, similar to how much you would air strafe normally. You can also use this trick for pixel jumping to your side. Jumping over sentries. This is a tip that you might have heard of, but I'll mention it here anyways. Basically, when you encounter a sentry while undisguised, you should jump This way you avoid the sentry's lock on for a bit, so you close distance with the sentry and sap it. WM1. With Spy, there are times where you can just straight up hold W at someone, then press M1, like when the enemy is going along you after a backpedal or is async and spamming their strafe keys. If you do this when someone is going along you, it's called a deadlock stab. If someone is async, spamming their strafe keys, it's called the glue stab. I did not come up with these concepts, but I'm incorporating it into my system anyways. I found this trick quite useful when dealing with other spies, although you'll have to passively track them to do this, and if they read it, they can counter you with a passive counter, so beware. Risk and safety. When playing Spy and trying to improve and play well, you're gonna need to have a good balance between risk and safety. If you play Spy in such a way that you get killed a lot of the time by being too risky, you should try to play as safely as you possibly can to balance it out. If you play Spy in such a way that you miss opportunities that you would have gotten otherwise because you were playing too safely, try to play as risky as you possibly can to balance it out. If you play Spy in such a way where you're consistent but you're not improving, you should add a little bit of risk to keep improving. Dead Ringer. If you want to use the Dead Ringer, you can flank the enemy, then leave flank and push towards your own team, stabbing anyone in your way. Your team acts as a backup plan. If you meet someone in flank, you can either retreat back through flank or leave flank to go main. If you are too far back in the enemy's territory, then you can spawn camp the enemy, although this will not be ideal. If you're caught out, then you can go behind the enemy spawn and come back to spawn to spam camp some more. You're also gonna have to rely on pre-stabbing corners a lot, while also sticking close to walls, close to corners, so the enemy reacts to you as late as possible. Learn to use high ground and blind spots in the enemy's FOV. You can use the scout disguise to peek over a ledge. You can use the spy disguise with the knife out to have the thinnest player model when hiding in a corner. You can also use disguises in places that those classes are usually in. Don't look at the enemy when you're disguised and keep your eyes on your own team to trick the enemy. Invis Watch. When it comes to the Invis Watch, the best way I found to use the Invis Watch is by baiting the enemy constantly. You can go invisible and pop in and out of existence whenever you want, so you have a lot of time to bait the enemy, so take full advantage of it. Playing without kunai. If you want to play well without kunai, especially with Dead Ringer, then you're gonna have to rely on pre-stabbing, cover, HP control and your gun. Pre-stabbing I've already covered. You basically use the environment to block damage, and HP control is basically where you control an area with a health pack if you're trying to chain without kunai. You should use your gun when the enemy is backing away or put themselves in a corner. Cycles. A level beyond rhythm are cycles. The enemy's reaction rhythm is essentially a cycle where the enemy reacts and acts. The enemy's attack rhythm is basically a cycle, unless they decide to break it or you make your movement unreadable. When the enemy is async and strafing seemingly randomly, there is also a cycle there. So after a few strafes, they then start taking wide strafes, and so on. This cycle can be broken by them reacting to you when you're too close. Conditioning. Conditioning is when you are predictable to the enemy, then break that cycle. If the enemy is actively or passively tracking you, you let their tracking counter your movement, and at the last moment, you break their tracking using active and passive. Sound. Sound is pretty useful when trying to figure out what's going around you, like what classes are nearby and how far away they are. Sound can also be used to determine the enemy's attack rhythm when they're aware of you, so you don't have to see the enemy to dodge them, especially if there are multiple opponents that are aware of you. Distance. When you're jiggling or trying to matador the enemy or whatever, remember that the closer you get to the enemy, the bigger your strafes seem to them. That's why the enemy can turn so much more to strafes closer to them than further away. Practicing rhythm. If you want to practice rhythm, you want to go into a pub and practice your juking. You juke your opponents and you sometimes trick stab them just so you have extra health so you can juke the enemy some more. This is the best way you'll get used to rhythm, and heavies are one of the best opponents to face when trying to practice your rhythm. Fake bait. All the bait techniques I have taught you in these videos, given enough time and exposure, people will know these tricks. But you can use that to your advantage. If someone knows a certain baiting technique, you know what they're gonna respond to it with. So you use that to your advantage. Quality of life. In the end of the day, TF2 is a video game, so when you die randomly to something, instead of being angry about it, you should just laugh it off. You'll go insane otherwise. You can talk shit and banter all you like, just don't rage. If you can't help it, then you should take a break and come back again. If you want to feel and play better, you can also exercise, sleep more and eat better. Hopefully you learned something new from this video. This video was even more theoretical than part 2, funnily enough. But I'm doing this because I want to make trick stabbing more optimized. I also wanted to provide some tools for theory crafting for anyone else trying to optimize trick stabbing. In pubs, trick stabbing is pretty easy, but on way better players, you will need to take more variables into account to optimize your trick stabs. I know I will be a massive hypocrite for saying this, but I hope people start using other loadouts more, because in the future everyone and their dog will be able to chain with the kunai in pubs. So I think it will be interesting to see chains with other loadouts besides just kunai and deadringer, and elevate the entire class in general than just this specific loadout. Anyone and everyone can be trick stabbed. It really doesn't matter how good someone is at the game, they will always be trick stabbed with enough skill. Anyways, go out and be the best.